to attend, and it should be streaming live across social media platforms as well. So while we're waiting for everyone to trickle in, please feel free to write in the chat where you're joining us from. Hello, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Syracuse. And someone asked if this is being recorded. Yes. We got a lot of Brooklyn and Harlem in the house. Hello. We got Brownsville in the Bronx. Hello, Manhattan Young Dems. This is great. Awesome, more Bronx, Manhattan, Hudson Valley. Hello, Far Rockaways. All right. Keep saying hello. And once again, for anyone who just joined us, there is a closed captioning option at the bottom of your screen. Press CC and then show subtitles. Again, we're recording this. So to kick us right off this evening, we're going to be discussing what the good cause eviction bill is, why it's important at this moment as the eviction moratorium is set to expire on January 15th, only 4 days from today. So we'll also hear from tenants who have been fighting against a predatory landlord whose very business strategy is premised on displacing tenants across Brooklyn. Then we'll talk about how you all can be involved in making sure good cause eviction passes in the state legislature. And finally, in the second half of the event, we'll open it up for Q&A. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask your questions or use the Q&A function. I'd like to start us off by introducing New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, who has only been on the job for a little bit over a week, but already getting busy. So hello, Brad.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you for organizing tonight's event. Thank you, Senator Salazar, for being the leader on good cause eviction and organizing together. We're honored to be working with you, with Housing Justice for All, with the Greenbrook Tenant Coalition, on tonight's critical event. I'm actually coming to you not from Brooklyn tonight, but from the Bronx. I'm up here for a vigil for the families that were killed in this just heartbreaking and horrific tragedy. But you know, this is not just about a tragedy from a space heater. This is about the lack of heat in that building in the first place. So many tenants there and so many tenants around the city and around the state in buildings with a history of violations, but in many cases where they feel afraid even to complain about those violations, lest they wind up evicted. And of course, it's about New York's housing market, in which affordable housing is so scarce for working families that people are often forced to live in desperate or unhealthy or sometimes even deadly conditions, as we saw with the basements of Hurricane Ida and with these units here in the Bronx. So the fight that we're in to protect people, to make sure they can stay in homes, are a fight for decent, safe, healthy homes for working class families and middle class families and all New Yorkers, because everybody needs a place to live, and you should not have to live in a place that's unsafe, and you shouldn't have to get kicked out into the street because your landlord would make a few extra bucks. So we're up here tonight in grief, but we're here in anger as well, and we're going to channel that anger into the fight for housing justice, including the fight for good cause. One of the ways that we honor the memory of these families is with the fight to protect tenants and the fight for good cause. So we're gonna actually, to kick us off tonight, and I'm so honored to introduce Kujeji Kamara, who's a leader in the Bronx African community and a programming manager with Muslim Community Network, who wrote a poem that just so channels that grief and rage. And we thought it was the right place to start tonight. So Kujeji, thank you so much for being here to share it with us.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Greetings of peace to you all. I'm in a friend's car. I'm multitasking here. I'm at the Gambit Youth Organization, a wonderful grassroots organization that's really been spearheading the rapid response here for the communities affected by the Bronx fire. And I'm a community volunteer, and I also work at the Muslim Community Network, and just really grateful that the communities are rallying around to support one another. And I just want to say, I was at the building yesterday, and you see the cracked windows, and you look at how many of our people, our community member, people of color, immigrants, who have to make a home and a life there. And so it's imperative that these structures are actually there to allow them to thrive, not just exist, but to thrive. And I hope that this is going to be an impetus for us to really rally around change that's been long needed. And with that, I'm going to share a poem that I hope provides some healing for us all. We were just trying to breathe. Sorry, guys, I'm on a call. Yeah, she left it in though. Sorry, guys, multitasking here. Okay. We were just trying to breathe, trapped in stairwells, Black bodies overwhelmed by Black smoke because this country can underwhelm. We were just trying to keep warm. We were just trying to stay alive. But somehow in this country, to want to stay alive means you have already died, means you have already lost. They will say malfunctioning space heater, not malpractice. A door left open, not infrastructural negligence, because our bodies are not worth a functional investment. Our Black bodies left West Africa's sun-dipped shores to wade into America's wind-chipped borders, dreams now ashes. They will say we inflicted our own death, not that we were making space ourselves, forced to carve everything from nothing. Building 333, steeped in violations, no, we were violated. Failure to comply, no. Heat was withheld because Black bodies are not worth nurturing. The essential fact of capitalism is creative destruction. Our people's health and safety destroyed to fill up pockets of greedy landlords. An irony that to ask for heat, instead of compliance, we got silence laced in fire, an overindulgence that drove us out, handcuffed us into cardiac arrest. The system gutted us out of our homes. Now it needs to be gutted. How many times do we have to die to finally be able to breathe? To the martyrs, may you breathe in God's everlasting abode. May it taste like sweet honey. May it remind you of the warmth you were denied. Mercy. May the mercy he affords you outweigh the pain you endured. May our promise that you did not die in vain allow you to finally take your rest. Thank you.
Whew. Thank you, Kujeji. Let's give Kujeji some props in the chat and on our screens as well. That is just like so powerful that you whatever, in this time of grief, like find a way to share that with us. And I think your points both about just how much it hurts and about how we're required to see it, how we're required to understand the broader context that forced people into this situation and to these deathly conditions is really amazing. So thank you. We'll can provide, the few people are asking about getting a copy of the poem. Can we do we have it to share?
Yes, definitely. I can email it to Karim. Is that okay? Or you want me to put it? I don't know if I'm able to put it in the chat if
you can put it in the chat, please do. And if not, we'll email it. We'll email it out to people as well. We're going to email people some thoughts on how they can help through volunteering. Definitely. It's amazing that Gambian Youth Organization raised $750,000 on their GoFundMe. Yeah. So they've actually stopped taking contributions and are looking for volunteers. So yes, please, we'll share the poem. We'll share some ways people can contribute. And again, as we pivot now to focusing on fighting for good cause eviction to protect tenants, we're doing it in the memory, as you say, of those martyrs and, people whose memories we are going to fight to protect. Look, there's been an affordable housing crisis long before this horrific Bronx fire and long before the Bronx COVID-19 pandemic. Back in 2019, there were nearly 17,000 evictions in New York City. That's nearly 50 families forced out of their homes every single day. There have been temporary solutions during COVID crisis, the eviction moratorium and the emergency rental assistance program. but they're just stopgap measures. And as we move through the pandemic and the city recovers, the structural features of our housing market that displace tenants and destabilize communities will remain. And of course, there's a set of actors who profit off exactly that. In the aftermath of the 2008 mortgage crisis, private equity and corporate landlords like Greenbrook Partners, who you'll hear from in just a minute, consolidated their hold on our housing markets. The Federal Reserve found that corporate landlords like that are twice as likely to file evictions as small-scale landlords. And that's why New Yorkers are fighting back. You're going to hear in a few minutes from some tenants from a set of buildings in the district I used to represent called Greenbrook Partners. I'll be honest, when I first learned about good cause eviction, I had in mind the tenant in a three-unit building in East New York. You know, there's gentrification, the rezoning takes place, there's speculative buying, and that tenant's at risk, even if they're paying their rent, of getting made homeless, that kind of immigrant or low-income family. And that family needs good cause eviction protections, but so do folks like Untu and her neighbors, middle-class folks in buildings that just a private equity-backed landlord saw as a profit center, and so acquired over 100 multifamily buildings with the plan of throwing people out of their homes in the middle of a pandemic simply to return money for private equity investors. And those folks need good cause eviction too. So as we move to recovery, we know that a just recovery must prioritize keeping people in their homes and not the profits of private equity landlords. So good cause eviction protections, when they are passed with champions like Senator Salazar and Public Advocate Jamani Williams and all of you, that's going to protect 1.6 million New York households, giving them a right to a lease renewal, including 750,000 families in New York City. With this fight, we can stop cycles of displacement. We can make sure people can stay in their homes. We can contribute to the health of all our communities. So I really appreciate people being in this fight together. I'm going to be here for a little while. I'm going to step out to this vigil, and then I'm going to come back. But I just, the grief we feel, we can channel into the fight to make a difference for other tenants. And it's just such absolutely critical work. So we've got a great crew of people with us tonight, and I really want to thank all of them. I'm going to kick it over to the lead Senate sponsor of the bill, who's been in this fight for a few years now, really leading the way in good cause. Senator Salazar, thank you for all you have been doing to fight for tenants, and especially for being the lead here.
Thank you so much, Brad. Our New York City Comptroller, you really have been a supporter of good cause eviction since the beginning, and I deeply appreciate that. I'm Senator Julia Salazar. I represent New York's 18th district in Brooklyn, which actually is where I am right now in Cypress Hills, East New York, but also represent Bushwick, Williamsburg, part of Greenpoint, and Bed-Stuy and Brownsville in the state Senate. And I want to talk about why this bill is so important. New York was already facing an affordable housing crisis even before the COVID-19 pandemic struck. And it's really outrageous that even while residential tenants make up the largest constituency in our state, the vast majority of tenants are unregulated tenants and lack basic rights to renew an expiring lease and to not be priced out of their homes. During the pandemic, we've had some relief from policies like the eviction moratorium, which, as we hopefully all know, is unfortunately expiring this Saturday, January 15th. And we also have created the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, ERAP, last year. These were just to meet the immediate and urgent needs of this pandemic and this crisis. But we really need to fight for long-term sustainable policies in order to address this ongoing crisis. And that is what the Good Cause Eviction Bill seeks to do. The purpose of the Good Cause Bill is twofold. One, it is to protect against unconscionably high rent increases, and it is to protect tenants from unjust evictions, from no cause evictions, as we might say, and their right to stay in their homes. We really need good cause because it would establish what, and this may get a little wonky, but I think it's important to understand what the bill truly does. It would establish a rebuttable presumption against eviction if a property owner seeks to increase the rent in a calendar year by an amount that is either 3% or of the current rent, right, that they've already been paying, or 150% of the annual change in what's called the consumer price index. It's essentially more commonly known as the rate of inflation. And so whichever of those metrics is higher, right? So right now, given that inflation is increasing and is pretty high rate right now, there would be an assumption that a rent increase on the current rent of like 8 to 10% or more than that would be unreasonable. This would just give tenants the ability to say, in a situation where they've been paying their rent, that at the end of their lease, or if they don't have a lease, but the landlord seeks to increase the rent by this unreasonable amount, that they would be able to defend their right to stay and continue paying their current rent, what they can afford to pay, beyond that. They would be able to make their case in court. Additionally, it would prevent landlords from just evicting without any reason at all if a tenant doesn't have a lease or if their lease ends. In the bill, it mentions that non-payment of rent, of the current agreed upon rent, is actually good cause to evict. And so, this is not something that would help every single tenant in every single situation, but the most reasonable situations where tenants are being threatened with eviction, and especially in what are known as holdover cases. There also are some exemptions in the bill for owner-occupied properties with fewer than 4 units. So basically, when a small home owner lives in the home, or situations where the housing is otherwise already subject to rent regulation, right? We don't want to mess with that. But that basically is what the bill does. And I'm happy to speak more if you'd like about, the status of the bill right now.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, okay, sure. Well, I introduced this bill back in early 2019, almost exactly 3 years ago now. And since then, we have gained a lot of support both in the legislature and outside of the legislature. There also have been local versions of good cause eviction that have passed in localities around the state, right? Obviously, this bill would be statewide legislation. That's critical because here in New York City, we have a fair amount of our rental housing is rent regulated or subject to some kind of regulation, but a lot of it is not. And this is a more severe problem outside of New York City, where there really is not rent regulation in most places outside of New York City. And so what this bill would do is finally provide protections that similar to what rent regulated tenants have in all of these other parts of the state, where tenants and families are frequently living every day in fear of losing their homes because they just don't have these rights codified under the law. In the city of New York, unfortunately, there is something in state law called the Erstat law that prevents New York City from passing rent laws that would impose stricter regulation than we have at the state level. And what that really means in terms of good cause is that the city council would not be able to pass, for example, a local version of good cause in New York City, because it would be a violation of state law, basically, even though there is very popular support for good cause eviction protections in the city of New York, right? So we've seen the city council introduce and pass a resolution before in support of good cause, but that's kind of the most they can do under state law. However, in other municipalities and other cities and towns in the state, including in the city of Albany, they have passed legislation that brings local good cause protections that is modeled off of this bill. And now several municipalities in New York State have actually passed similar legislation. And that's really encouraging because what it demonstrates is that there is popular support for this in different parts of New York State. There is a need for it. There is existing legislation in Syracuse, for example, and in Ithaca, different parts of the state that are very different from New York City, but where there are still tenants who are increasingly struggling to afford enormous rent increases or to stay in their homes. And right now it's more urgent than ever that we pass good cause eviction protections because it looks like the eviction moratorium may not be extended, and additionally, if the eviction moratorium is not extended, we really need to, this is the moment to permanently codify protections for tenants who otherwise wouldn't have them, and to stabilize the housing market as well.
Thank you so much, Senator. That's a really helpful explanation of what this bill both is and isn't and what's going on right now. And we'll definitely come back to, given the current state of the bill, what can we do next to make sure it actually passes? So next we have Public Advocate Jamani Williams, who has been an incredible powerhouse of advocacy for folks across the city. I know you might also be on your way to the vigil tonight, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on the urgency and impact of good cause too.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Thank you. Peace and blessing, love and light to everyone. Thank you so much. I am going to be heading to that vigil, and so I have to be a little more brief than I wanted to, but thank you for having me as part of this conversation. Thank you to Comptroller Lander, State Senator Salazar, of course, Pamela Hunter in Syracuse, Tia Weaver, Housing Justice for All Coalition, all the advocates, everybody who's here, even the people who I see pulling some negative comments up here. Appreciate them being include everyone. So it's important that we do so. But as I said before, Governor Hope will stay at the state, we can't return to normal. And so I know folks want to return to normal very quickly, but normal didn't work for most of folks who are suffering the most in this pandemic. Frankly, it didn't suffer for most of us in this state, in the city. It didn't even work for most of the people who are pushing back on this bill. And so we have to be clear about that. I did want to ask, if I could, State Senator Salazar, just to clarify that in this bill, it does not impact owner-occupied properties under a certain amount. Can I just get a clarification on that?
Yes. So for an owner-occupied property of fewer than 4 units, and then are also additional exemptions if an owner seeks to take possession of a unit for their own use or for the use of a family member, then good cause doesn't apply as well.
Thank you so much. That's very important. And I always come from these, and some people may know or know, but I come from this and the aspect of being a tenant. I come fighting for tenants' rights. I also come from myself having experience of having tenants, and I understand it's in all ways. And it is important that we always separate things out. I think it is important we look at people, 1 or 2 family homes who live in their homes and are trying to make it through. And we look at what's happening across the state, because we know most of the state doesn't look like New York City. And so there are people very much trying to make it by themselves. And this really is focused on people who have additional housing to make income. And by the way, I want people to make income. I want people to be able to feed their families, but we do have to balance it out with people who actually need housing. And as we look at the backdrop of where we are right now, we look at eviction moratorium that is going to be just a few days allowed to lapse, as the governor said. We look at the fact that the ERAP, many people didn't even know they were going to be able to apply, and they just got it reopened. We look at evictions about to increase, and the housing crisis further exacerbated, as was mentioned by the Comptroller, by takeover of rental housing markets by large investors, predatory corporate landlords. Evictions are considered a growth in some of these models, which we know. But we have to look at even the folks who are not owning these as predatory equity firms. The impact that this has on housing all across the state is great. We simply can't have the compounded impact of letting an eviction moratorium lapse, of not having the type of housing that we need, and have people go into homelessness. We just can't have it. Good cause, if you think about it, it really is the most common sense that you can have. It is not saying you can't evict someone if they're not paying you rent. It is not saying you can't evict someone if you need this unit for your house, for your family. It is simply saying, let us now say why we are evicting someone. Because the vast majority of housing in the city and even the state is rental. I mean, there's a large portion that is rental. So if we do not protect these units, we will be facing an additional mass homelessness crisis to the ones that we have. And so for the folks who are pushing back, I would love to understand why something so basic as simply saying, tell us why you want to evict someone, is a problem. Like, it's not saying they're allowed to destroy your property. It's not saying they're allowed to do things that violate the lease. It is giving lots of reasons actually why you can. It's just saying that you have to give a reason that makes sense. Because what we've seen more often than not, even acknowledging that there are a lot of folks who take home ownership very responsibly. So I want to acknowledge that. But what we've seen too often are people, and having been a housing organizer, by the way, in tenant organizing before I became elected, I often would have to ask tenants before I can help them get repairs, are you rent regulated or not? Because if you were rent regulated, I can help you because you're going to get a lease. And if you weren't, I would tell you, listen, I'll help you try to get the repairs, but you may not get a lease renewal. That's a terrible choice to have to make. And so I think it's important that we provide protections for people that are fair, thinking about both sides. This bill actually does that. It actually says if you're owner occupied, we understand what you're going through. You're living in your home, you're trying to get additional income. I probably would actually made the protections a little lower, maybe 2, 3 family, but it's up to 4. So that's even greater. And, if you're going to make income off of housing, it can't be at the expense of increasing homelessness. We've seen people try to double their rent as a way to get around any eviction protections that they have. They're saying, look, we're not going to evict you, but you got to pay 100% or more of the rent that we're giving, which is a de facto eviction. So these protections are known to help on so many levels. This is the basic minimum of what we need. And you can't have the compounded eviction lapse and no good cause eviction and be in the middle of a pandemic like COVID and be in the middle of the winter and say you need only 100,000 units all across the state when everybody knows you need 600,000 to 700,000 at minimum. We have it all wrong here. And so I've been excited to jump on this for such a long time. It's something we've been fighting for a long time, something that I believe we can get done. It's something that's actually needed. And I think when people first hear it, it sounds a little shocking, but if you actually break it down to what it is actually quite sensible. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. I'm sorry that I have to jump. I'm not sure I'll be able to come back like the Comptroller, but I'm happy that I can lend my voice and that my office is here I think EVBNMA from my office is on here. I can't see everybody else. I'm sorry for not thanking folks, but we have to. I saw somebody mention, whatever you are, someone said 5 units is not a landlord. Whether they're a landlord, property owner, someone who has the responsibility and owns units that people rent from, we have to make sure everybody's protected on both sides of that. We also, by the way, I want to make sure people are not being foreclosed on. So that's a whole issue. I don't think anybody here wants anybody to lose their home. But right now we're talking about the tenants that need protection, and this bill does that. So thank you, everybody. Peace and blessings. Love and light.
Thank you, Jamani.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pat, Public Advocate, both for being here and also being at the vigil tonight. And I also wanted to highlight how you mentioned that good cause is common sense legislation. And up next is clearly an example of why, because up next we have some of the biggest superstars of the hour, Antu and Charles, who have really been fearless tenant leaders and advocates in their fight to save their own homes. And it's been absolutely amazing to work alongside them. So Antu and Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole, and many thanks to Comptroller Lander, to Public Advocate Jamani Williams, and most of all to just all the folks fighting for good cause, state senators Julia Salazar and Tia Weaver for just facilitating this space. My name is Antu Nguyen. I am a tenant in Park Slope at a building 70 Prospect Park West, part of a broader network of called Greenbrook Tenants Coalition. I'm one of those middle class people that people talk about and who are impacted by good cause. I live in a building where there are people who have been living there. It's a mixed building, partly stabilized, partly market rate. There are people in the building who are working class, who are middle class, like people who drive school buses and work at the fire department, all the way to being corporate executives at big banks. For one, I work at a nonprofit organization doing small business development in primarily immigrant communities, and I've lived in my apartment building since 2009, so over 12 years now. Every month paying rent on time. It's not cheap rent, it's market rate. $33.50 a month is literally still, the rent is quite high for where I live. And you could say that we're one of those model tenants, at least in my case. Paid rent on time every single month for years, even through COVID. And then one day found out that we had a new landlord, and the next day found out that landlord was giving us a notice to vacate and literally doubling and tripling rents in vacant units. This is why good cause is important. We hear stories, sure, we hear horror stories about tenants who don't pay rent. I noticed that people are saying in the chat, but at the end of the day, this is about protections for working New Yorkers, the people who keep the lights on in the city, the people who are doing just trying to live and survive in what is a global pandemic, and fighting against basically corporate entities that are using this crisis in order to extract as much money as humanly possible from tenants. So for people like me, good cause is incredibly important for us to maintain stability, for me to keep my job and do the work that I do and continue to live in New York City. And that's why it's critical on my end. And as I started to work with other tenants, I got to meet Charlie, who has a very similar story. And so alongside the tenants of over 110 buildings, 90% of which were bought during COVID by a private equity landlord, who have similar stories. People who have been living there for years, people who have raised families, who are now being faced with a choice whether to stay or to leave, and really it's not really a choice because they're being forced out. So I'll pass on to Charlie to tell his story.
Thanks, Antu. So like Antu, I've lived in my unit for over half a decade. I have roommates, and I had a pretty good relationship with the prior landlord. A mom and pop shop that would pick up your phone call. And then in the midst of the pandemic, a private equity group bought our building for a song. I think it was, yeah, it was just a really, probably some behind the back doors wheeling and dealing, I'm guessing, but they bought the building for a song, and they just started kicking out all the tenants left and right. We have 17 units in our building, and then after they kicked out almost everybody, we had about 7 occupied, and they didn't even offer lease renewals. I was one of the lucky ones who was actually, you negotiated a lease renewal, and but it comes due in the next couple months. And so 12 months ago, I was paying under 3,000, and I just got my renewal for next month, and it's 46.50. So, this is absurd. And I don't know if we're able to share, in the screen. I like data, I like numbers. Here's just a chart that shows you, when I had the mom and pop landlord, they increase it a tiny bit every year. It's not that much. And you can obviously see when these, big jumps happened, that's, that was when this massive private equity firm, came in and started trying to push out people like me. And so the data speaks for itself, at least in my anecdotal case. And I just think that it's not fair, and we shouldn't be destroying communities like this, because when you show some loyalty, you become part of the community, you're contributing to it, and then they just push you out, and when it's 10 degrees below freezing, to force you to try to find another apartment. So I'm a big supporter of good cause.
And what I want to speak to is that, tenants, regardless of how much rent that we pay, regardless of whether we're rent stabilized or we're market rate, still have to deal with the fact that we don't necessarily ultimately have the protections because we don't own. And we live in spaces where we cannot necessarily afford to own, regardless of what our income is, regardless of what we do for a living. And this is part of the importance of good cause, which is, yes, you might make a lot of money, or you might rent and pay a lot of money for that. In my case, the reason why I could afford my apartment is because I have 2 roommates as well, just similar to Charlie. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to afford living in New York City either. And for families that can't have roommates because their roommates are their children, that having things like good cause is incredibly important, right? As a single person, I can make it work somehow, some way. For the families that live in my building, that's just not possible. Things that impacts their family, schools, everything. And having good cause is really critical in order to maintain the stability and the fabric, the social fabric that just keeps the community together in any area. So I think this is where it's so important to just really consider that, regardless of where you're coming from, having basic protections that if you are living in a place and you are taking care of a place, you're stewarding it as a tenant, you should have be able to ask, why am I being told to go? If I'm doing the best that I can as a tenant, there needs to be a good cause for being told to leave. So we're really, really supportive and just grateful for the efforts of everyone here who's pushing for those protections.
Thank you.
Oh,
Charles.
Sorry, what one last thing I just wanted to mention was, in the time I've been there, like I said, they've raised the rent, crazy amount, and they've done nothing in terms of adding value to the apartment. I have a lot of sympathy and respect for landlords and developers who go out there and actually create value, and do business above board. But it's this specific case of predatory capitalism that we're trying to solve for here.
Absolutely. And onto Charles, the solidarity that you and your fellow tenants have built across multiple buildings has turned into such a clear example about why we need this. Your organizing journey has also been incredible, initially thinking that this landlord Greenbrook Partners only bought up a few buildings in Park Slope, and then learning that they bought up over 100 buildings across Brooklyn and are systematically displacing tenants across those buildings, and then starting to conduct illegal and hazardous construction as a way to harass tenants out even further. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Jeffrey from Fifth Avenue Committee, an organizer who has been with them every step of the way. If anyone in Brooklyn ever needs help with tenant organizing, please reach out to Fifth Avenue Committee, who have been such great and incredible partners here. So now that we have a better sense of the mechanics of good cause and its impact, I wanted to turn this to Cia Weaver from Housing Justice for All, one of the state's leading housing justice organizations, fighting tirelessly in Albany in the freezing cold this week. Could you talk some more about the path to victory and how anyone else interested on this call could plug into that?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for clarifying some of the facts and myths about good cause eviction. I want to reiterate some points that have already been made tonight, but that I think are just so important for some clarity here. Good cause eviction just requires a landlord to have a reason to pursue an eviction case. We know that so many tenants are evicted without cause every single day. If the landlord decides that, they don't like your haircut, if a woman gets pregnant and the landlord doesn't want to have a child in the home because they think that that will be loud and disruptive, those are not good reasons to evict people. Those are discriminatory reasons to evict people. And all that this bill does is allows tenants to have a fair process to negotiate with their landlords on rent increases and on lease renewals. It regulates it regulates the eviction process. It allows tenants to say in court, I actually don't think I'm being evicted for a very good reason. It allows tenants to negotiate a rent increase in court. Landlords are still allowed to raise the rent under this bill, but it just levels the playing field so that tenants and landlords can fight on a fair turf about, how much rent is going to go up. It can go up higher than 3%. It can go up higher than 4%. There is no rent cap in this bill. And it allows tenants to say, I need to be able to stay in my home and this landlord is evicting me for discriminatory reasons. This bill is so important for the stability of our communities. I'm just going to give one example from education. When a tenant is evicted, when a middle schooler is evicted, they feel that impact for the rest of their life. Moving a lot when you're in middle school has lifelong impacts on your ability to socialize, to be able to grow and emotionally thrive, and to be able to hold down work decades later, right? So stopping this is important for the well-being of our society, right? For the future of our society. And if you are evicted and you are having trouble staying present in school and participating in like the sort of like community fabric of your society, that's bad for everybody. Even if my children are housed, if 1 in 10 children in the New York City public school system are currently homeless and 100,000 students are evicted each year, if my child is housed and stays housed all year, but is in a classroom with 2 or 3 or 4 children facing eviction, that's bad for my child too, right? So this bill is good for everybody. And it's good for small mom and pop landlords who have strong relationships with their tenants. I have a really strong relationship with my landlord. She lives on the first floor. I am so grateful for her, and this bill doesn't penalize mom and pop landlords. It penalizes corporate actors who are pursuing evictions based on greed and discrimination, and that's why we need it. I'm really grateful for the public advocate and the comptroller and Senator Salazar who are leading this fight across the state. And I'm grateful for the work of housing advocates and city council members and state legislators who are fighting for this bill in local legislatures and in the state right now. And I want to agitate people a little bit. We are closer than we have ever been to pass this bill. We really are. We're doing a great job. You all are doing a great job fighting for this bill. We had a hearing on Friday in the state Senate. We are working all week to make sure that assembly members and senators and the governor is talking about this bill. And we are confident that a local version will pass in Kingston and in New Paltz, and even a resolution in Buffalo next week. But we really need statewide protections. So that's what we are fighting for. I'm going to drop in the chat ways that you can get involved. It's housingjusticeforall.org. Call your rep. You can call your representative and say that we need protections, and we need protections right now, because as the eviction moratorium expires, which Governor Kathy Hochul said that it was going to do, we need tenants to be able to negotiate the terms on which they get to stay in their homes. And that doesn't mean that no landlord will be able to pursue an eviction. It means that we need tenants to be able to fight a fair fight. And that's all that this bill does. One more thing I would like to just say about this bill is that I support more housing, and this bill doesn't impede the production of new housing. Under this bill, landlords can set first rents. Developers can set first rents. And what that means is that when you build a building, this law will not regulate the rents that you're setting in this building. This bill will have no impact on the production of affordable housing. We have had this bill in New Jersey for over 40 years, and New Jersey is experiencing a housing construction boom right now. This bill does not impede real estate development. In fact, it allows real estate development, it allows for investment without displacement. That is something that we all need. That is what we all need. And I just want to drop in the chat that it will be very, very important for you to call your representative, tell them to support this bill, get involved in the housing movement. And please, don't listen to the misinformation that is being spread about this bill. This bill does not cap rent increases. This bill does not allow you to stop recouping investment in your properties. This bill just simply prohibits discriminatory evictions. And that is so vital for the health of our entire state. There is no one, we have asked landlords, we have been talking to landlords extensively. Mom and pop landlords are a part of our work and a part of our movement. I believe that. And when we ask good faith mom and pop landlords, who can you not evict under this bill? They say no, that this bill is fine. When we ask folks, who do you want to evict? That this bill wouldn't allow you to evict, there's silence, right? So I just want to say that we need to make sure that we are paying attention to the renters and the homeowners who are fighting collectively for this bill, and get involved in the fight for housing justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sia, and I hope folks are inspired to help Housing Justice for All, especially this week as the eviction moratorium is set to expire. I'm going to turn it over to Q&A now. We've got a lot of questions, not a lot of time, so I'll try to highlight a couple of them. One question is from Brandon Clark. Would the sponsors kindly illustrate how this bill and its provisions would serve to mitigate the risk of a homelessness crisis within the context of the COVID pandemic and the pending expiration of the state's eviction moratorium, given that it does not restrict eviction proceedings for non-payment or of rent per a lease agreement? And I think we should tie that also into another question we got in the registration form, is that, say, good cause eviction does not pass, what happens when the eviction moratorium expires? What recourse, what resources do folks have?
Sure, so I can take that one. It's like a few questions in one. But first of all, I do want to talk about the homelessness crisis. There are tens of thousands of people in New York City alone, even more across the state, who lack stable or permanent housing, who are experiencing homelessness. And many of those people are actually experiencing homelessness because they were at some point evicted from their homes. Evictions drive homelessness. This is a fact. And so being able to protect tenants who currently have virtually no protections under the law from an unjust eviction, being able to protect them from eviction will certainly lead to a decrease in the number of people who are becoming homeless. Now, I will say, there are other policy proposals that are critically important that we need in order to provide housing for people who are experiencing homelessness, right? The Housing Access Voucher Program is one very important piece of legislation, for example, that I fully support. We really need an investment from government at every level in order to reduce the current homelessness crisis and really confront it meaningfully. And so Good Cause is, as a single bill, not designed, unfortunately, to eliminate homelessness. But if Good Cause were law, it definitely would have a positive impact on preventing families from becoming homeless in the first place, and even just from being displaced and experiencing the profound instability of losing your home due to an eviction. There was an additional question in there that I wanted to address. Oh, with the eviction moratorium, right? This is crucial. So as of right now, the governor is indicating that she isn't interested in extending the eviction moratorium. We are still nonetheless pushing for the eviction moratorium to be extended because there are different circumstances in which someone during a pandemic and during what has been an economic crisis for so many people and working people, there are other circumstances in which somebody may be threatened with eviction, including inability to pay their rent. Good Cause is not designed to protect someone who is unable to pay the rent that they have already agreed to pay through a lease agreement or any agreement with their landlord, right? So non-payment is considered good cause to evict under Good Cause. What we need in those cases is, of course, to extend the eviction moratorium, but additionally to fully fund the emergency rental assistance program, which also provides both assistance to landlords who are owed rental arrears, and it also provides security for tenants who owe rent that is accumulated throughout the pandemic. Thankfully, we have learned that later this evening, tonight, the ERAP, that program, right, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, that portal is reopening tonight, so that landlords and tenants will both be able to apply if they haven't applied yet. There still is a lot of assistance that needs to be distributed to people who are eligible for that. So that is another way that that people will be able to receive assistance. However, if we fail to extend the eviction moratorium after January 15th, there are so many tenants who, even those who have been paying their rent throughout the pandemic, and maybe they didn't lose their job, but their landlord is now trying to increase the rent and knows that without an eviction moratorium, they would be able to evict their tenant or bring a holdover eviction proceeding against them, evict them for any reason. Those eviction proceedings will be able to go forward without the eviction moratorium or protections for those tenants. And so those are the stakes. If the state fails to act, then we will see unjust evictions happening after this Saturday, January 15th. And it's why it's so important for us to push to pass this legislation and to extend the moratorium.
Thank you so much, Senator. I know we're running low on time and don't have too much time for too many more questions, but what do you see as the biggest challenge to passing Good Cause, Senator? I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it and see you as well.
Sure. Gosh, I think one of the biggest challenges that we found this past Friday, we had a public hearing on the Good Cause eviction bill. And it was co-chaired by the Senate Housing Committee Chair, Senator Brian Kavanaugh, and Senator Brad Hoylman, who's the chair of the Judiciary Committee, which is where the bill is referred to in the state Senate, and myself. And we were constantly having to correct, even in a public legislative hearing, in the public record, we were constantly having to correct false statements that were made by bad faith landlords during the hearing that violated what the bill actually says. And it's not a very complicated bill, but there is deliberate misinformation about the bill because there are people who their interests are in profiting off of rental housing and not in providing safe and secure housing for people. And in those cases, they want to be able to evict someone for any reason and raise the rent as high as they want for any reason. And so that is what we are up against. That's the biggest challenge is those interests who are trying to spread misinformation and prevent us from doing the right thing in the legislature.
Yeah, I second that. There's so much misinformation. I'll pass it over to Brad.
No, go ahead, Sia. I'll go after you.
I just think, there is a lot of misinformation about this bill, and that misinformation is an obstacle. But I also think that the reality is that another obstacle is that tenants are afraid to organize. Tenants are afraid to speak up for their rights because if they do, they will face a discriminatory eviction. So I want to thank Antu for doing all of the work that she is doing to organize the Greenberg tenants. It is very hard to speak up for your rights to a human right to a home if you know that your landlord can retaliate against you. We see it every single day. I know our constituent services offices see it every single day. So I just want people to know, if you're listening to this panel, you are not alone. We will fight with you. We will stand with you. It will make it less scary. It will still be scary, but we are here, and we want to meet you and help you fight for your home. And that fear of retaliation is an obstacle to this bill.
And I'll just add first, I just want to let folks know I'm up here in the Bronx at the Vigil. This is the building, and we've got this beautiful set of people out here. But speaker after speaker, in addition to expressing grief for these families that are lost, are speaking to what it means to have a housing market that so dehumanizes people that it just doesn't see them as worthy of safe, decent, affordable places to live. And I just do see that as the biggest kind of fundamental barrier here. Landlords in the chat, I see you. Like, obviously, we want it to be possible for people to operate good, safe, decent housing that people could afford to live in. I'm proud just to have fought for the Gowanus rezoning to enable us to create thousands of units of new housing at both market rates and affordable rates. But we've come to have a vision of the market and the housing market where the simple idea that you shouldn't put people out in the streets for no reason at all is somehow controversial. And that makes no sense. There is room in the market for people to cover their costs, to make sure that people pay their rent. But the idea that what you need is the unfettered right to throw people out of their homes in a pandemic for no reason at all. And if you heard the Greenbrook stories, you really see that that's true. These are buildings where people are paying a lot of rent. They're paying their bills every month, and nothing more than greed, nothing more than profit, organized in that case by a private equity real estate trust, wants to be able to acquire buildings and put profit over people's lives. And, that is where we are right now. So I would say what we got to do first is say, okay, look, there's a lot else going on in the world, a lot else going on in the marketplace. But this bill just says you can't make people homeless. You can't kick people out of their homes for no reason at all. I agree. Most landlords are not greedy. And that's why this bill just says for those who would throw people out of their homes with no reason, New York State's not going to allow that. We're going to have some reasonable provisions in place. And that's hard to do. We are making some change. We've lived in a society that has let people be kicked out. So we're talking about an average of 50 families a day being evicted every single day. We're now saying that's not where we want to live. We want to live in a place that provides some basic protections for people. So that's hard. That's big change. That's why I give big props to Housing Justice for All, to the senator, to the Greenberg tenants, to folks who are fighting for change. Let's be resolute and keep pushing.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, everyone. We are just about at the end of our event. Thank you for everyone who tuned in and is ready to take some action. Just want to remind everyone what those potential actions are. Please plug into the work of Housing Justice for All. Call your state representatives this week and urge them to pass good cause eviction as soon as possible. As many have mentioned, housing is a human right. And we hope that even if this legislation doesn't impact you directly, that you help stand up for your neighbors. So we don't have a lot of time, but we have a lot to win if we keep fighting. So thank you again to our speakers for joining us, all the tenant leaders who are organizing every day. And thank you to everyone who came here to learn. And have a fantastic night.
And thanks to you, Nicole, for pushing
Thank
all
you,
of us to do
Nicole.
this and helping organize us in this fight.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
great
much,
evening,
Nicole,
everyone.
and Antu. Thank you, Controller. Thanks. Yeah, have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Nicole.